Hello, this is Diane Gremmel with the New Era Times. We are here today with Edgar Jamail. He is one of the world's foremost authorities on the Edgar Cayce remedies and the works of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet. Today we're going to be talking about medicine, science, and how it is only in the last few years begun to understand that so many of Edgar Cayce's remedies are purely scientific. So welcome.
Well, thank you.
And it is nice to have you here, Ed.
Thank you. It's good being here.
One of the things that fascinates me about the Edgar Cayce remedies is how many of them doctors have researched and now understand this is why that worked. This is why that strange herb worked. This is why breathing in whiskey fumes worked. So it's validating a lot of the work that he did. So briefly, Edgar Cayce was a psychic.
He was a psychic who was able to put himself into the self-induced trance and was be able to go through and the whole body the way he would do that if it was a health reading and analyze the body, what was working, what wasn't working, and what needed to be helped, and would recommend then a regimen. So Edgar Cayce's remedies are basically natural, using things available in the United States.
Okay.
Because in his day they didn't have the international trade and commerce that like we have today. So the remedies had to do with body, mind, and spirit. And it called upon a person not only to treat the body, but also deal with the attitudes and emotions, and also the purpose in life.
And even that in and of itself was sort of novel for that time in the early 1900s, correct?
Yeah, I would say that that was novel. There were many doctors worked with Cayce in those days because we did not have the technology that we've got today. The diagnostic tools of medicine are like magic. They really are wonderful, the advancements that we've made, which to me has always impressed me because Edgar Cayce was, in his diagnosis of the body, actually was showing us things that couldn't be seen at that time by the technology that was available.
Yes.
And yet from that higher consciousness he was able to see it the way it worked. He talked about several things that are interesting that I don't see too much of in medicine today. He made a comment that we are electrical beings in chemical clothing.
Oh, but he's so right.
But he is absolutely so right.
Yes.
So, of course, with electrical circuits, the nerves, the brain, all has electrical potential. And so the remedies that Mr. Cayce had were not only addressing the chemical composition of the body, but also the electrical and how it coordinated the body. So there were incidences there that are just absolutely like magic, and today I think are still just as relevant as they were 50, 60 years ago.
If you were to look at some of the cases, we've talked about this, it's fascinating, the cases where doctors are now saying, now I understand why that worked. There were diseases that Cayce was giving cures for before the doctors even understood that those diseases existed.
Yeah, they again, that ability to look into the human body, or the human condition, which is universal, and see the composition of the body and how it was integrated is amazing. For example, in the electrical composition, he saw that some organs had a potential of positive, and some organs had a potential of being negative, and they worked together. For example, the heart, when it got out of the electrical connection that with the liver or one of the other organs, that was the beginning of heart trouble.
And this was all channeled from a higher place.
That's right.
It was information that came through when he would go into a trance.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so he saw us as electrical beings in chemical clothing, and he treated the whole body, not only attitudes and emotions, and having a purpose in life is very important. If a person is very dramatic and has a purpose in life, they can have spontaneous remission from whatever might ail them.
Yes.
And there have been many cases of that. But the idea of being electrical beings in chemical clothing is a very interesting statement.
So he might go through the body and say, oh, well, the liver is sort of out of the electrical grid. We need to get everything back moving again properly.
Back in balance.
And that might have an electrical need, or it might be a chemical need, but whatever was necessary,
Right.
he would come through with.
That's correct.
And so are you familiar with any of the doctor's studies today that have talked about, I know that alkalinity is a big thing now in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Everyone's talking about keeping an alkaline body. Cancer cannot exist in an alkaline condition.
Right. I don't know too many doctors that are into it.
Mhm.
There was a clinic in Arizona, in Phoenix, and in Scottsdale, where they were doing work like that. But yes, we're chemical beings, and electrical beings in chemical clothing is the way Mr. Cayce put it. And the balance, electrical as well as chemical, is so important to health.
Mhm.
So the research that's going on now is absolutely wonderful. I have thick folders where I see various conditions, and the
Mhm.
doctors have just discovered this. And I says, you
No.
could have saved yourself a lot of research if you
Right.
just checked the Cayce readings
Yes.
from 80 years ago.
Yes.
Because there it is, there's all that information. Just about every ailment from A to Z that people experienced then, they're still experiencing now.
Right.
And there were Cayce recommendations. But there was one very important thing about that. We're not clones. We're individuals. And so if somebody came to Mr. Cayce and wanted a treatment for cancer, or a particular form of cancer,
Mhm.
he might give variations to the individual and the next individual, because he sees that each individual is really unique in the chemistry and
One
the
might have
electrical,
more psychological reasons, yes.
attitudes, and electrical potential, chemical
Dietary
potential.
issues, yes.
We're all different. And so there were interesting thing is, while there might be a common theme to his healing,
Mhm.
there might be variations for the same disease depending on the person asking the question, because he could see how their metabolism is different, or even their mindset is
Absolutely.
different. So that's why he's known as the father of holistic medicine, and as we mentioned earlier, he was recognized as such, as
Mhm.
an editorial in the American Journal of Medicine in October of 1979. So it's an interesting study on the human body, health, what brings us health, mentally and physically.
So what types of illnesses, we've talked about cancer,
Mhm.
what types of tuberculosis we've talked about, what types of illnesses were addressed in the Cayce readings, and what have we seen cures for through some of the Cayce work?
Well, every illness from A to Z that you can think of, with the exception of, say, things that we're just discovering
Correct.
in this country, like Ebola
Yes.
or AIDS. They didn't exist in, Mr. Cayce lived till 1944.
Mhm.
So those things weren't present in the United States at the time,
Okay.
and so there were no questions asked about it. But just about every other condition, human condition that doctors or medicine would treat,
Mhm.
you would find in the Cayce readings,
Okay.
A to Z.
And so if anyone has anything from encephalitis to cancer to an abscess on their colon, there is a Cayce reading that we can probably address that with.
Absolutely.
Take a look at with it.
Absolutely.
That is wonderful. We will be right back with more of Ed Jamail talking about the science behind the Edgar Cayce readings. I'm Diane Gremmel with the New Era Times. This is Diane Gremmel with the New Era Times, and we are back with Ed Jamail. We are talking about healing, the science behind healing. And Ed, one of the things that I found fascinating when you were talking about electrical bodily systems and chemical bodily systems, did Edgar Cayce ever feel that perhaps he had a difference in his electrical body system or chemical body system that allowed him to receive this information when a lot of us don't?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Edgar Cayce was just as human, and as you married, had 2 children.
Okay.
And he was a photographer,
Mhm.
basically as a career.
Yes.
At one point in his life, and actually developed a technique in photography
Mhm.
that was featured.
Okay.
Was innovative or
Mhm.
insightful, I might say.
Okay.
So that was his profession, but as time went on, he was so much in demand as a psychic by some of the biggest people in the United States. Harry Houdini, for example, went to Virginia Beach to show Cayce as a fraud.
Right.
Harry Houdini made a career of going around and exposing frauds.
Right. And there were a lot of them, let's be honest.
Of course, there certainly were.
Yes.
But he left Virginia Beach not able to explain what Cayce said and was very impressed with Cayce. So there were many people that we mentioned earlier that scientific as well as political, Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, people like that that had actually readings from Cayce.
Yes.
So the interesting thing about Mr. Cayce is he was just as down to earth as anybody you ever want to meet. I had a privilege to know a member of the Cayce families. Mr. Cayce never made money at all. He gave away many of his readings free.
And didn't live high off the hog, I know.
Didn't live high off the hog at all. But to meet him on the street, he was just like an average person.
I always thought he looked a little like Harry Truman, only thinner.
I call it Ichabod Crane.
Ichabod Crane.
He had that Appalachian look.
He had a very normal demeanor. If you hear recordings of his voice, there was something just very average about him. So what did he attribute his ability to? Does he feel he was able to reach this pocket of information that many people are not able to?
Mr. Cayce got into an area in his life that was then, and more so probably than it is now, and it had to do with reincarnation. And he had spent previous life where he was into the spiritual field like that.
Okay.
And so this was a building block. That whatever had gone before, this was the next step.
I was a healer in Atlantis, and I'm a healer now, that type of thing.
That's exactly correct.
Okay.
So in his early life, there's no real explanation here. He was in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. He was just a normal, farmer.
But there was a story about him in school, wasn't there? About his spelling lessons.
Yeah, well, he was having trouble. And his father was somewhat of a disciplinarian, and he was quite angry with the kid because he wasn't learning his lessons. So out of the clear blue, Cayce told his father, said, "Let me sleep on it, and
that's what I would have said.
Come back." Yeah. So what he did was the book he was studying from, he put it under his pillow and he slept on it. When he woke up, he knew every word in the book. Now, that was the beginning of a very phenomenal life.
So even at that young age, he did have the ability to receive information in a different way than most people are aware that they can.
Very much so, yes. And having experience with unseen, like for instance his grandfather who had passed away, he communicated with the grandfather. So he was able to see onto the other side. It's a natural ability. And
he saw dimensionally creatures that most of us do not have the visual acuity to see, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Yeah. And woodland folk. And
the woodland folk,
yes.
Yeah, exactly. We have, according to Mr. Cayce, and I'm not one, I can't prove it or disprove it, but there's a whole life around us that we don't see.
I believe that 100%.
At a higher vibration.
That we just have to tune into that vibration.
We have to tune into the vibration.
Absolutely.
And as I say, I'm not one who's been able to do that, so I just take their word for it, that there's something out there.
But there are so many people who have, I think, looking at how valid even medical science believes some of the Cayce readings are today, is very good for those people who do see a little outside of the normal scope of things. And there are so many of them who do see, hear, or feel slightly beyond what the average person can.
Well, when you get into like quantum physics and the higher vibrations, there's a whole different universe out there that the average person doesn't see. But even for the animals that we know, there are animals we can see in spectrums of light that human beings can't see.
Yes.
So we're developing.
Anyone who's ever seen their cat staring at someone who doesn't seem to be there knows that.
I think so. The animals are can be pretty perceptive if we pay attention to them.
So, Ed, are there any other stories? I know there's a physician who was talking about why he believed the castor oil packs work.
Castor oil, I think I mentioned before, was known in the Middle Ages and even up today in common terminology as the palm of Christi because of its curative abilities. And it's being studied, I remember an article a couple of years ago in the Lancet, which is the British medical journal, about using castor oil and experimenting with certain superficial cancer tumors. And they were doing some pretty successful work in it. So the Cayce approach to castor oil is mostly externally. He did not recommend it. We think of it, why we cringe, as a laxative.
Oh, yes.
Cayce did not recommend castor oil as a laxative at all. So it's a poultice that helps to purify and cleanse the liver in common ways across the abdomen, on into the kidneys. And as I say, I know of one person, one case, that tried it for gallbladders and dissolved the stones without having to have surgery or any type of medication. People with certain kidney diseases had, where the kidney actually stopped functioning and just began to function again normally. So palm of Christi is very interesting. It's probably one of the remedies that Cayce most recommended. There was the castor oil, something called glycothymoline.
Now tell me about glycothymoline. We haven't talked about that.
It's an old antiseptic, and Cayce recommended it for a number of things, like, for example, alkalinizing the body.
Yes.
And able to ward off infectious agents that come primarily through the nostrils or through your mouth. That should be slightly alkaline. So to do that, Cayce recommended 6 to 8 drops of glycothymoline in a glass of water and just drink it. It's an antiseptic, but you don't really taste it. It's not that strong, and certainly not that amount not harmful.
Right.
So that's how to keep the body slightly alkaline. And you can get pH strips from our local pharmacy, and you can test the alkalinity or the acidity. We know, for example, that you can get urinary tract infections, but the urinary tract is acidic. So certain infectious agents can live in an acidic situation. None live in an alkaline situation. So Cayce recommended the body be kept slightly alkaline, and that's glycothymoline is one of the ways you can do
Did
that.
Edgar Cayce talk about juicing? I know someone who arrested their lupus through juicing, and this was alkaline juice, fasting with juice. Did Cayce have anything to say about
using the diet, going heavily into the vegetarian state does keep your body slightly alkaline. So that would be part of the process that he'd recommended in many of his cures. In fact, if there's a common theme that runs through all of them I mentioned before, it would have been the diet. So keep the body slightly alkaline.
Alkalinity retards aging too, correct?
It does, yeah. Vegans tend to...
Which explains Christy Brinkley.
Yeah, vegans tend to be, seem to age very gracefully, I'll say, and slowly. So that, keeping the body slightly alkaline is one of the big reasons. And glycothymoline is one of the ways they can do that.
And all of these are things that I have watched in my lifetime the doctors sort of discover.
You know, Alkalinize or Die is a common book that's on the market today that most people can read.
Well, even things like, we were talking about hypoglycemia, something that I remember my mother being diagnosed with that when I was a child, and it was a new in vogue disease. But that's something that is mentioned in the Cayce reading several times.
Yes, and one of the remedies, and one that I use, is a diluted form of the glycothymoline. With distilled water, emphasizing distilled water, and I use them as eye drops.
Interesting.
And it helps you to retard or prevent cataracts. Now, at my age also, I've never worn glasses, and I attribute that to two things. The use of the glycothymoline as eye drops, which I do periodically. Because, as I mentioned earlier, living in the big city, there are two parts of our bodies that are most impacted by pollution. It's the lungs and the eyes. And so I use the glyco faithfully twice a day, in the morning when I get up and the evening before I go to bed as eye drops. And you wouldn't think of putting an antiseptic in your eyes.
But it helps. It works.
It is. But there is a particular combination. I mean, you're not just going to put the raw glycothymoline in your eyes.
One more thing I wanted to touch on very briefly before we run out of time is that if I remember you saying that there were actually people who recovered their sight or hearing through chiropractic, and that that's something that Cayce dealt with.
He did, but in his day it was osteopathic.
Okay.
And osteopaths are very much into spinal manipulation.
Okay.
Back in the 20s and 30s. As a matter of fact, many medical doctors at the turn of last century also were practiced in spinal adjustments.
Okay.
But I don't think in Mr. Cayce's days, like the 20s, that chiropractic had come into vogue, but osteopath were
Right, same
using
principle.
It's the same principle.
Yes.
So yes, the very important part in health is to keep the spine in alignment and the spinal column unimpeded.
Okay.
And chiropractic adjustment will do that.
So for those people who want to stay in good health, keep your spinal column unimpeded, watch to keep an alkaline diet, lots of healthy vegetables.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd suggest?
Well, a balanced life, Mr. Cayce, a balance between rest, recreation, and work.
That's something we all
And
can
that's
listen to.
very important, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Ed Jamail. We are so grateful to have this wonderful expert on holistic health with us. And for the New Era Times, I'm Diane Gremmel. We thank you.